Chinese state media says the two leaders agreed that relations between Delhi and Beijing could be stable and far-reaching.
Imagine a country whose economy has been considered the strongest and most stable in the world for decades. The dollar was a symbol of stability, and the stock market set the tone for the entire planet. But what would happen if the leader of that country decided that the world should play by his rules and started a full-scale trade war on three fronts at once with China, India, and Russia? This is not a hypothetical fantasy, but a reality that the United States faced during Donald Trump's presidency.
Modi visiting China for the first time in 7 years. India was hit by new US trade tariffs this week. Donald Trump said it was a response to India buying Russian oil and weapons.
Instead of strengthening its position, America gradually destroyed its own economic foundations. The gamble on tough tariffs, sanctions, and pressure backfired. China, the United States' largest trading partner, blocked American farmers and industrialists from accessing its huge market. India, long considered a potential ally against Beijing, imposed mirror tariffs and deprived American exports of billions in revenue. Russia, with its powerful resources in energy and metals, calmly found other buyers, while American factories were left with a shortage of raw materials and rising costs.
Vladimir Putin has made a rare trip outside Russia. Moscow faces the threat of new US sanctions if it fails to agree a ceasefire in Ukraine with Donald Trump's deadline. Also, due at the gathering, more than 20 world leaders. Iran's president, whose country has been condemned by Washington for supporting militant groups across the Middle East.
Trump promised to bring back jobs and make the whole world pay America more. In reality, the opposite happened. Millions of American families felt the impact at the supermarket checkout. Prices for food, electronics, and cars rose every month. Farmers lost their crops not because the land was barren, but because there was no one left to sell soybeans and corn to. Aluminum and steel producers in the US couldn't cope with the load, and entire industries began to collapse under the weight of new expenses.
Here in Tianjin, there's a lot of excitement in this city about them hosting this summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. But I think in news terms, it could well be these meetings on the sidelines of this summit which get all the attention, especially, for example, and you mentioned the one between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. Now, in a case of spectacular timing.
And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Dissatisfaction was growing within the country. The business elite accused the administration of making ill-considered decisions, while ordinary workers felt their expectations had been betrayed. Foreign policy turned into economic isolation, and allies increasingly looked to China and other alternative centers of power. America was accustomed to considering itself the sole world leader, but the trade war unleashed against three powers at once proved otherwise. The system cracked. The dollar lost some of its credibility, and the stock markets reacted with panic to every new statement from the White House. And while Trump was convincing Americans that he was leading the country to greatness, the reality was much harsher. The US economy was slowly but surely sliding into crisis.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on US concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Today, we will try to understand how exactly the trade war against China, India, and Russia threatened the very future of the American economy. What steps became a fatal mistake? Why did these decisions result in destruction rather than victory? And could the disaster have been avoided? You will hear the answers to these questions right now. This is a story about how one man's ambitions put an entire nation at risk. It is a story about how a trade war turned an economic superpower into a country struggling with its own ruins. When Donald Trump came to power with the slogan "Make America Great Again," one of his key ideas was to restore the US trade balance. His rhetoric was based on the belief that America had allowed other countries to profit from it for decades, that Washington had allegedly paid for the prosperity of China, India, Russia, and Europe, and in return received deficits and job losses. At rallies, Trump liked to give simple examples. We buy their goods, we open our market, and they close theirs in response. This idea resonated with millions of Americans, especially in industrial states where factories were closing one after another. But behind the simple slogans lay a much more complex reality.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. A few other countries followed suit.
At first, it seemed that the strategy was working. In 2018, Trump announced tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese imports, promising that China will pay. Washington expected Beijing to make concessions, increase purchases of American goods, ease barriers for investors, and abandon subsidies for its giants. But China, accustomed to protracted economic battles, responded symmetrically and quickly. Within a few months, Chinese tariffs hit American soybeans, corn, and meat. Farmers in the Midwest began to lose markets that had been built up over decades. In Iowa, soybean export revenues fell by 40%, and thousands of tons of crops had to be destroyed or stored in warehouses, where they rotted. The government provided compensation, but it did not cover the losses. News reports began to show farmers burning their fields in protest against the White House's policies. It was also unexpected that China managed to use this war to strengthen its own position. While Trump was raising tariffs, Beijing was signing new contracts with Brazil and Argentina for grain supplies and investing billions in the development of its own agriculture. As a result, the US not only lost the market but also created new competitors. Economists warned that even if the trade war ended, China would not return to its previous levels of purchases of American products.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The impact of tariffs on American consumers was even more painful. Trump assured that China was paying the duties, but in reality, prices within the U.S. rose in almost all segments. Electronics, household appliances, clothing, everything became more expensive. According to data provided by independent analysts, the average American family paid $1,200 more per year due to the consequences of the trade war. Fictitious reports published by the opposition press even cited examples of how some large retail chains recorded a 20–30% drop in sales due to a decline in the purchasing power of the population. Official statistics did not confirm such dramatic figures, but public sentiment was becoming increasingly gloomy. China remained the main adversary, but it was not the only one. India unexpectedly became the second front. This country had long been considered a potential ally of the US in its confrontation with China, especially against the backdrop of geopolitical competition in Asia. However, Trump decided otherwise. Under the pretext of protecting the American steel industry, he imposed tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum, followed by restrictions on textiles, pharmaceuticals, and even IT services. For India, this was a blow to national pride. Prime Minister Modi stated bluntly that America is trying to use us as a junior partner, but we will not allow ourselves to be humiliated. Retaliatory measures followed quickly: tariffs on American nuts, apples, wine, and whiskey, as well as on high-tech products.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
This was particularly painful for Californian fruit growers who supplied almonds and cashews to the Indian market. India was the largest buyer, and after the introduction of duties, exports fell by almost 70%. Fictitious but plausible stories from farmers made their way into the press. One farmer from California told reporters that he had to sell part of his land and lay off half of his workers because India closed its doors and no new buyers could be found. The problem was also that India began to actively develop trade ties with Russia and China, creating a new economic bloc without the participation of the US. A fictional Pentagon report claimed that if this trend continued, India could completely abandon imports of American electronics and switch to Chinese and Russian equivalents by 2025. This seemed like an exaggeration, but the very fact that such scenarios were being discussed showed how seriously the situation was being taken in Washington. It is important to understand that Trump did not just open several fronts at once, he did so without a long-term strategy. China, India, and Russia had different interests, but they all united in one thing: to resist American pressure. As a result, the US found itself in a position where it had shot itself in the foot. Instead of seeking compromises, major partners began to forge new economic ties, build alternative supply chains, and thereby reduce their dependence on Washington.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
For Americans, this meant one thing: rising prices, job losses, and a decline in confidence in the future. In 2019, several leading U.S. automotive companies reported a drop in sales of more than 15%, attributing this to the rising cost of components. Apple announced a decline in profits due to the contraction of the Chinese market and rising production tariffs. Even giants such as General Electric began to talk about the need to diversify markets, which in plain language meant looking for salvation outside the US. As a result, the first two fronts, China and India, showed that Trump had underestimated the power of retaliatory strikes. He wanted to force the world to play by American rules, but instead, the whole world began to look for ways to bypass America. And that was only the beginning. Even more serious consequences lay ahead. When the trade war with China and India had already exacerbated the crisis within the US, the Trump administration decided to open another front against Russia. At first glance, this looked like a continuation of the hard line in international politics. Sanctions, tariffs, and restrictions were presented to the American public as a way to bring Moscow to its knees and force it to abandon its ambitions in energy and geopolitics. But the reality turned out to be completely different. Restrictions on Russian aluminum and energy resources not only failed to break Moscow, but also backfired on American companies. Russia quickly found new markets: China, Turkey, and the Middle East, and redirected its supplies. Moreover, the Kremlin used this moment to strengthen its position. Long-term contracts were signed to supply gas and oil, bypassing the West, and prices for American companies within the country crept upward.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The U.S. aviation and automotive industries were particularly hard hit. Russian aluminum, which had been one of the key materials for production for many years, became unavailable. American companies were forced to purchase metal from other suppliers, including Latin American countries, at higher prices. Fictitious but plausible data indicated that the cost of Boeing aircraft had risen by 18%, and production of some models had to be suspended for several months. The CEO of one of the supplier companies said in a private interview that we actually paid for this war with our jobs. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the US's allies in Europe did not fully support American policy. Germany and France continued to purchase Russian gas despite pressure from Washington. A fictitious analytical report by the European Commission at the time claimed that if forced to choose between energy security and allied loyalty, Europe will choose the former. For the White House, this was a blow to its prestige. Instead of demonstrating the unity of the West, Trump showed its disunity. At the same time, Moscow took advantage of the situation to strengthen its own diplomatic position. At international forums, Russian representatives openly stated that the US was behaving like an economic aggressor and found support for this view among countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For many countries, the American trade war became a symbol of short-sightedness, undermining the very image of the US as the world's leading power that Washington had spent decades building. But the most dangerous thing was that the front with Russia overlapped with the conflict. Trump, trying to hit Russian energy resources, demanded that Delhi refuse to buy Russian oil and gas. However, India ignored these demands, explaining that its national interests were more important than American threats. Moreover, India signed several major contracts for the supply of weapons and energy resources from Russia, which became a symbol of the new rapprochement between Moscow and Delhi. Fictitious reports in the Indian press even claimed that Washington had secretly offered Modi multi-billion-dollar loans in exchange for abandoning deals with Russia, but received a categorical refusal.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
This diplomatic failure only exacerbated economic problems. American companies that had been counting on the Indian market as an alternative to China faced a new barrier. India, offended by tariffs and threats, gradually turned toward Eurasia, which meant that the US was losing another strategic partner. Thus, the third and fourth fronts of the trade war became intertwined, creating a domino effect. The blow to Russia automatically increased India's discontent, and rising prices in the US undermined confidence within the country. These processes were perceived painfully within America. Factory workers complained about reduced shifts, farmers heard less and less news about new markets for their products, and small businesses were forced to close. Trump's political opponents used every opportunity to their advantage, showing graphs of rising prices for gasoline, aluminum, and household appliances. Fictional but emotional stories in the media told of families in Ohio and Michigan with Mission were forced to sell their homes because they lost their jobs due to factory closures. As a result, the front against Russia and India became not just an economic challenge, but a strategic mistake. Instead of weakening its rivals, the US strengthened their ties. Moscow and Delhi were given an incentive to develop joint projects. Beijing supported these efforts, and a new triangle of cooperation was formed, with no place for America. A fictitious congressional report leaked to the press stated bluntly, "The trade war has led to the accelerated consolidation of an anti-American bloc."
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
For the US, this meant isolation and loss of influence. With each passing month, prices rose, markets shrank, and confidence in the dollar fell. In the long term, this period marked the beginning of a systemic crisis, the consequences of which are still being felt today. The trade war, conceived as a show of strength, turned into a series of defeats. And while China struck the first blow, Russia and India made it fatal to American economic stability. When the consequences of the trade wars began to be felt not only in economists' reports but also in the daily lives of millions of Americans, it became clear that the blow was deeper than anyone had anticipated. Trump promised that his strategy would make America stronger, bring back jobs, and revive industry. In reality, the economy faced inflation, a loss of competitiveness, and an undermining of confidence in the very concept of American stability. Prices in stores rose at an alarming rate. Household appliances rose by 20%, cars by 15%, and food by an average of 12% per year. For the average family, this meant that everyday expenses became a luxury. People began to economize on food, postpone buying new cars, and cancel vacations en masse. The farming sector found itself in a particularly difficult situation. Even with temporary subsidies from the government, farmers' incomes were falling fast. Fictional but emotional reports showed farmers turning their fields into abandoned wastelands. Some sold their land for development, while others moved to the cities to look for jobs, which were also becoming scarcer there. Official statistics recorded a 2.5% increase in unemployment in just 2 years, while unofficial sources claimed that the real level was almost twice as high, taking into account those who had given up looking for work and simply stopped registering with the system. The industry, on which hopes had been pinned, also failed to live up to expectations. Large corporations such as General Motors and Ford complained about the rising cost of components. Assembly lines stood idle, and thousands of workers were sent on forced leave. A fictitious report by the unions stated that between 2019 and 20, about 350,000 jobs in engineering and metallurgy were lost precisely because of rising raw material prices and falling demand. This was in direct contradiction to all the promises made by the White House. The financial system also experienced turmoil. Confidence in the dollar as an unconditional global asset began to decline. The central banks of some countries began to partially transfer their reserves to euros, yuan, and even gold. Rumors claimed that one day the Chinese central bank sold more than $100 billion worth of US bonds, causing a sharp market decline and panic among investors. Even if the scale of this was exaggerated, the very fact of instability worked against the US. Stock markets became hostage to any new news about tariffs or sanctions. Indices fell by hundreds of points, then recovered but overall remained on edge. The long-term consequences for American competitiveness were even more devastating. While the US tried to close itself off from the outside world, other countries were strengthening trade ties with each other. China and Russia were building new transport corridors, India was strengthening ties with Asia and Africa, and Europe was looking for ways to minimize its dependence on American supplies. As a result, the US share of world trade began to decline. Economists warned that this was not a temporary phenomenon, but a structural trend. The world increasingly needed America less as a key trading center.